Welcome to part 1 of the Swordfighting Bible. The focus of part 1 will be about exploring the very basics of sword fighting, just to make sure that we're all on the same page. If you're very experienced in the puzzle, you might want to skip this part and go straight to part 2. Let's start. In sword fighting, each turn you receive a double piece from your fourth column, which you can then move and rotate. The main goal is to block your opponent's fourth column, which makes them unable to get any pieces, which means you win. This is what we'll call the main win condition, and we should always keep it in mind. Forget anything else for now. We want to block the opponent's fourth column and at the same time avoid getting our fourth column blocked. In order to approach this goal, we need to learn specifically how the game mechanics work. Starting with the basics. Whenever you break blocks and pieces, you send attacks to your opponent. The type of attack varies depending on what you broke. If you break a chain of single pieces, you will send a sprinkle. There is another type of attack that you can send, called the strike. You can send this to your opponent whenever you break blocks, which are formed when, as the name suggests, you form blocks of pieces of the same color. That was it for the basics. How do you use what we just learned to work towards our win condition? Roughly speaking, sword fighting is all about working with your board. You want to receive and send attacks in such a way that you come out ahead, and once the opponent's fourth column fills up, you win. Before we look closer at all the strategies and tips and tricks that will bring us closer to the win condition, we need to get a better understanding of how swords and sword patterns work. When sending sprinkles, the attacks sent are based on the bottom 2 rows of the sword's pattern. When sending strikes, the attacks are based on the whole pattern. In the case of strikes, if the strike is longer than the whole pattern, then it will keep repeating the top 4 rows of the sword. If you are wondering to yourself, what the hell does that mean? Then don't worry, because I got plenty of examples and hopefully it will be clearer in just a second. Let's look at a foil, a sword everyone knows and loves. When we send sprinkles with a foil with the following pattern, the sprinkles sent will be the bottom 2 rows repeated. This is what a 6-layer sprinkle would look like from the foil. Meanwhile, if we send strikes with the foil, the attacks will use the whole foil pattern, because it's 4 pieces high. So the whole pattern will just keep getting repeated. Here are a few more examples of how different attacks by the foil look like. Pause the video if you want to take more time looking at these. Now let's take a look at a more complicated case, the skull dagger, notorious for being good for sending sprinkles. Let's take a look at a 6-layer sprinkle from the skull dagger. Notice how messed up the center is. But let's look at the strikes. You will see in a moment what I meant by the top 4 rows repeating. This is a result of 3 2x9 swords. Notice that this strike is longer than that of the pattern, which is only 5 pieces high. The way it works in these cases is that it first applies the whole pattern, and then repeats the top 4 rows of the pattern. Hopefully that cleared it up a little bit. As an exercise, look at the following sword, the rapier, and try to imagine how 3 2x12 strikes would look like when they clear. Pause the video if you need more time to think. Well, that's one ugly board. Let's just go over exactly what happened here. We can see that the first 6 rows are just applied from the sword pattern normally as they should, but from row 7 and upwards we can see that the top 4 rows of the rapier are the ones repeating. We can see that the top 4 rows repeat once and then repeat again at around row 10. And just for reference, so people don't go out trying to use the rapier in games, here's how the rapier sprinkles look. Okay, now that we understand the rule set with regards to sword patterns, we are better equipped to understand how to get better. Keep in mind we are nowhere near finished with regards to swords or their patterns, the playstyles that favor each sword, the specifics of different matchups, in-depth counter strategies, and my personal tier list will be saved for a future video. And the last thing we'll cover in part 1 is combos. When solid blocks break, the same thing is sent to the enemy with a few exceptions. The most common exception being the 2x2 block, which sends the enemy a 1x4 sword. Another one is the 3x3 block, which sends a 2x4. Blocks such as a 4x4 or bigger are honestly not worth mentioning because of the amount of times you have a 4x4 built in a real PvP sword fight is pretty rare. One thing to keep in mind is that there are no swords that are wider than 3 pieces. The general rule for how the swords transform is that the resulting area of the slimmed down strike has to be less or equal to the area of the original block. By using this rule, let's consider the case of a 4x4. It has the area of 16, so the resulting 3x-N sword has to have an area lower than 16. But in this case, we get a 3x5 sword with an area of 15. Before we look at the combo formulas, let's take a look at the horizontal strikes. They're fairly intuitive and there's only one variant, the 2-block high one. Everything works the same way except for the fact that if a horizontal sword were half its length wasted, it converts into a vertical sword. The most common case we see this is when we bingo a 3x2, which turns into a 12x2. But since the board is only 6 blocks wide, that would mean half of it would be wasted. So instead it converts into a vertical sword that is a 2x12. Now let's look at sprinkles. Sprinkles follow a formula where you take the amount of pieces you break, divide by 2, and then you round it down. For example, if we break 12 pieces, the amount of sprinkles we send will be 12 divided by 2, which is 6. Notice we don't have to round down because 6 is a whole number. When comboing blocks, horizontal blocks will go forth in the horizontal direction, but all other blocks will multiply in the vertical direction. Here is an example of doubling a 3x2, which turns into a 6x2. And here is an example of a 2x3, which when doubled gives you a 2x6. Notice that if you double a 2x2, you will get a 2x4. Now we are ready to tackle combo calculations. The gist of it is that when you send a combo, you multiply each part of the combo by the appropriate multiplier and add up all the contributions. Let's try a harder example. We'll single 4 pieces, double 2 pieces, triple a 2x2 and 8 pieces. And finally, bingo a 2x2 and 4 pieces. Another thing that's important to mention is wasted strikes. When you send more strikes than what can fit onto your opponent's board, these swords disappear completely. Poof, vanish into thin air. That's why it's a good idea to be smart and split up your combos so you don't waste your huge swords because you sent 2 smaller swords earlier in the combo chain. The big question that's left unanswered, for now, is what decides where the attacks will land. We will go over the underlying mechanics on exactly how that works in a future video. That's about it for part 1. We've covered the basics of sword fighting. Now you should have the knowledge required in order to approach the more difficult stuff that we'll cover in future videos. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in part 2.